Holy City Center Radio. It is episode 264, and I am your host, Christian Sanger. Today is Friday, June 14th, 2024. Hope you enjoyed the last episode, my interview with Jonathan Mookie Morant. I loved recording it. I hope you all loved listening to it. Be sure to check it out if you haven't already. He's got 2 books out right now that have uplifting messages and might motivate you through some difficult times. Definitely go listen to that. Also, if you're looking for plans this weekend, go to holycitycenter.com/calendar, where you will find the original. Well, not the true original, but the one that everyone remembers the most. If you paid any attention to the calendar on Holy City Center, that's the one that most people seem to really like. It's back. We'll say better than ever. I don't know, I guess. It's the same program, but it's the one that people liked. So go check that out if you need to find some plans, not just for the weekend, but at any time. But I'd like to remind people on Fridays is that's when most people are looking to get out. And I hope you do. I hope you have fun. I hope you have an amazing weekend doing whatever it is that you do. Not too much going on here. I mean, there's a ton going on in my life as always, especially with that new role I talked about. But nothing really worth reporting back upon that you guys would really be that interested in. So we've got a episode today where I'm going to catch you up on some election results. You may already know the big headline ones, but just in case, I'll give you some background on those. And then where a couple other races stand that you may be interested in and didn't realize, that they were in the news. And then, of course, if you're looking at the show title, there is an update to National Nancy, Representative Nancy Mace, and the ethics complaint against her. There's been another little wrinkle added to that. And, so we got some things to talk about. So let's get into it right now. First, the good news for Representative Nancy Mace. She, on Tuesday, moved a step closer to getting a third term representing South Carolina's first Congressional District. After she took care of 2 primary challengers, didn't even have to go to a runoff, which you sometimes see when there's 3 or more candidates in a race. She was able to beat both of them. She also, as you may remember, got an endorsement from former president and convicted felon Donald Trump. And did that endorsement matter? Maybe. But the reason the endorsement is kind of part of the headline is because not only did he endorse her, but Catherine Templeton, who had the second most votes, was backed by former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So the good news for Nancy Mace before we get to the bad news is that she won the Republican primary and it wasn't particularly close. So in addition to beating Catherine Templeton, there was also a Marine Corps veteran by the name of Bill Young, who made a little bit of a push kind of late in the process, but ultimately did not matter. For those who aren't familiar with Templeton, she's been around South Carolina politics for a while. She's run for several offices. She served as a former director of the South Carolina Department of Labor, Licensing and Regulation under former Governor Nikki Haley. And she actually was positioning herself in this race as like the more conservative candidate, which is interesting because Representative Mace is pretty darn conservative. And she attacked Mace for what people on both sides of the aisle attack her for, which is, flip-flopping, specifically flip-flopping for fame, which has been a criticism, again, from both sides of the aisle. And Templeton was the one, as I mentioned, who had former U.S. House Speaker, had the backing of the former U.S. House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, specifically financial backing from a political action committee, several actually political action committees tied to the former speaker. So that's why the whole Trump endorsement really comes into play here. So I don't know if it was like a true test. Like, I don't know how many hardcore Kevin McCarthy fans there are in South Carolina or anywhere. But that is what most people were talking about. And, he did endorse her and she won. So it's going to be part of the news. And why is this whole Kevin McCarthy thing tied into Nancy Mace? Well, because Mace was one of 8 House Republicans who voted to oust McCarthy from his speakership last year, a decision that surprised many of her colleagues. She got a lot of criticism from Republicans about that. So that is why that was also an important tie-in. So you may have known Nancy Mace won, but there's a little bit more background to it just for your own knowledge. But she is the Republican nominee. And who will she be facing? Well, that's part of the next segment. The challenger will be Democrat Michael B. Moore. He is a business executive, founding president of the International African American Museum here in Charleston, And, this is just an interesting tidbit, doesn't necessarily speak to how he'll be as a politician, but he is directly a descendant. I forget how many times great, but one of his great, again, I don't know how many times, grandfathers was um, Robert Smalls. I'm not going to go into the Robert Smalls story, but if you don't know it, it's pretty incredible. The big headline involves him stealing a ship from the Confederacy, but also he went on to a career in politics. A really impressive person in general, but specifically to South Carolina politics. So just another little tidbit about Michael B. Moore. But in any event, Moore secured the Democratic nomination for the first congressional district. He'll face off against Nancy Mace in November. That's when the general election is, of course. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of eyes on this election because District 1, not too long ago, did go Democrat when they voted Joe Cunningham in. Cunningham, of course, was then defeated by Mace. And then Mace ended up defeating her Democratic challenger, Dr. Annie Andrews, in the most recent general election. Now, of course, well, before we get into that, just so you know, his opponent was a attorney and Coast Guard veteran Mac DeFord, who also had a pretty impressive campaign. There was a lot of people backing him, leading up to this, but ultimately Moore takes home the victory. Now, although I mentioned everyone's going to be kind of focusing on this race, obviously this is a Charleston-based podcast from a Charleston-based website, and District 1 encompasses most of the people who are the targeted audience for Holy City Center. So we're always going to be paying attention to this race. But again, because it has transitioned recently, and it was in Republican hands for a long, long time before Joe Cunningham pulled that upset over Katie Arrington, it's going to be an uphill battle, not just because Mace is an incumbent and incumbents tend to have like a built-in advantage unless, they've really upset their base over something, but also because the U.S. Supreme Court recently upheld this Republican-drawn map for District 1 that a lower court had ruled was gerrymandered along racial lines. We've talked about that previously. So it's going to be a tough battle for Moore for many reasons. But you never know. District 1 could change because, as I mentioned before, Mace has received criticism not just from Democrats or left-leaning people, but also from Republicans. So it's always interesting when you see someone getting that kind of pushback, if they actually vote accordingly or if they just suck it up and vote for the person, even if they're not a big fan, because they just want their party to, they love their party more than their hatred or dislike for the current person in that role. So we'll see what happens. This is a race that doesn't really have a Charleston tie, but made headlines because of the person involved. State Senator Dick Harpootlian, who you may remember, and definitely a lot of people around the country know, because of the Alex Murdaugh trial. He was one of Murdaugh's defense attorneys. So he kind of rose to national prominence in some way, or at least recognition. So I know a lot of people know the name. And after seeing him defend Alec Murdaugh, I saw a lot of Democrats say they didn't really want to vote for him anymore. Well, it turns out that played out as he indeed lost his attempt in this most recent primary. Now, interestingly, he currently represents Senate District 20, but filed to run for state Senate District 26. So that means the District 20 seat was open as well. We'll get to that in a moment. So for this current race, District 26, he faced off against Representative Russell Ott, who was in that role already. And as I mentioned, Ott will move on. Now, if you're interested, District 26 covers Calhoun, Lexington, and Richland counties. And believe it or not, Harpootlian actually won Lexington County and Richland County, but Ott just completely dominated Calhoun County. It's not often you see something like that. Like they win 2 counties, only lose 1, and you lose the entire election. So, I mean, just really ran it up in Calhoun County. So Ott will move forward as the Democrat nominee. As for Harpootlian's old district, District 20, since obviously he ran for a different area, he's not available to be running for that district. So Ed Sutton, he actually ended up running unopposed in the Democratic primary, so he'll be moving on. Obviously, we'll see what happens in the general election if those the seats that currently belong to Democrats stay that way. Another race, this one's a little bit more of the Charleston area. But maybe not as high profile since the names, unless you're in the whole South Carolina political world, you may not know. But the race for South Carolina Senate District 41 is actually heading to a recount because the primary was just too close. Now, the recount will be done by the Charleston County Board of Elections on Friday, today. So obviously, I'm recording this before Friday, before that recount is done. So, by the time you hear this, the results may be out. But as of this recording, they're planning on doing the recount on Friday to determine whether incumbent Senator Sandy Senn or current House District 116 Rep Matt Lieber will head to general election. Now, recounts are mandatory and automatic in South Carolina and are triggered when votes between candidates are less than or equal to 1%. So if a candidate is leading by 1% or less, there's an automatic recount. So that's why there's no, there's no, accusations of anything going on, like the 2020 election, you saw all these rumors and conspiracy theories and stuff. This is just an automatic thing that happens. So no one's like accusing, oh, we need a recount because something's off. This is just what happens. So, and it's a very small margin. For the first count, Lieber is leading by just 31 votes. So, unless there's something very off about that, I would be shocked if it swings to Senn, but you never know. But it would look like Lieber will likely move on, but just 31 votes. That's all it took to win that race. If you're wondering the difference between the two, they're both Republicans. Lieber's a little bit newer on the scene. Senn's been around for a while. But despite being in the same party, they have very different priorities. Lieber's campaign, according to his website at least, is focusing on school choice, being pro-life, overturning firearm bans, road maintenance, and small businesses. Just snuck in those at the end after the far-right talking points of school choice, pro-life, and overturning firearm bans. Meanwhile, oh, and by the way, Lieber was one of the people who was very responsible for the Charleston County parks having to take down signs that said they didn't want firearms in the county parks. He was instrumental in making that be removed, so now people can open carry at any county park. Senn, on the other hand, her priorities, according to her campaign website, are traffic, flooding and overdevelopment, conservation, education, and support for first responders and veterans. What you would expect a state senator, regardless of party, to be focused on. Clearly the better candidate, but that's what happens sometimes in primaries. It's not the candidate that you think is best for that party. It's what the people in that party think, and it's usually the more extreme of them. So that will be interesting to see what happens on Friday with that recount. But I would expect Lieber to move forward into the primary. Into the general from the primary. All right, that's it for local election results. There's obviously many other races that took place. I encourage you to look those up, local news, or you can go to sevotes.gov or chsvotes.gov and see results for any races you're interested in. For these primaries, there's a couple other races. I think like Dorchester County Sheriff is moving to a runoff. So there's plenty to look at still. Those are just kind of the headline grabbing ones. I just can't go through every single race. So we're going to get into more news, even if it's still about politics. And this is an update to the Nancy Mace ethics investigation. So as a refresher, Representative Mace has been facing some scrutiny over expenses that she claimed, specifically expenses related to her $1.6 million townhouse that she has in Washington, D.C. So that was kind of the original controversy. Is under a new policy, people in the Senate and in the House of Representatives were able to claim things, basically to be reimbursed for expenses related to having to travel to DC, stay in DC, when they're away from their home states. And it was reported that Mace encouraged her staff to get the maximum amount possible. There's like a daily reimbursement fee that they can request, and she said no matter what we do, allegedly according to reporting from interviews with former staff, that she said no matter what we do, request the maximum every day as far as reimbursement, which of course is a no-no if you're not actually deserving of that reimbursement money. So that was kind of the original controversy. But now we know a little bit more about the investigation and another wrinkle to it. So the House Ethics Committee has begun a preliminary review of $23,000 in lodging costs that Representative Mace expensed in 2023 after receiving a complaint. This came from the New York Times. So there was a complaint saying maybe she is doing something unethical, and that's what triggered this preliminary review. It was noted by the Times that the expenses, like the amount that I just mentioned, that $23,000, was notably higher than what other members had filed in claims. So that also made it stick out. An analysis by Punchbowl News estimated that Mace had overcharged by more than $8,900. Now, that new wrinkle I mentioned, during that same period when she was claiming expenses, she also allegedly listed her townhouse, the one I just mentioned, the townhome, on VRBO, VRBO, all capitals if you're not familiar. That's a short-term rental site, and this was reported by the Daily Mail. So not only is she asking for reimbursement for this home she purchased in D.C., but then is also renting it out to get money in that sense as well. So this is all going to be looked into. I don't know what exactly each individual ethics rule or standard is. This, in all likelihood, will end up with, at most, a slap on the wrist of some kind, if anything at all. But just shows you, we all know I'm no fan of Representative Nancy Mace, and I've, constantly on this podcast have pointed out these alleged ethical issues amongst, the flip-flopping, lying, and things like that we've seen. Just another example of what Catherine Templeton kind of alluded to. She's more interested in fame and enriching herself versus actually governing and doing what's right for the people in her district. And our last story, this has been the news for a little bit. I just haven't had a chance to get to it. But a very disappointed ruling, and which led to some students, teachers, lawmakers, and activists urging the South Carolina Department of Education to reverse course and go back to offering an AP African American Studies class to students here in South Carolina. This stems from what happened on June 11th. June 11th was the day that the activists, students, and teachers and representatives from other groups such as the South Carolina NAACP, the South Carolina Educators Association, Low Country Teacher Advocates, and others gathered at the State House to denounce the department's decision to stop offering the course, saying, amongst other things, this was an attack on public education. So these stakeholders also criticized the way that the department had acted upon the decision, and when they did decide to do it. The timing was bad because it affects planning at the school and district level, as well as college prospects and other aspects to people who have taken this course or are planning on taking it. Now, what is this all stemming from if you're not familiar? I mean, I mentioned, obviously, it's the Department of Education saying they're not going to offer this AP African American Studies class, but what's a little bit more of that background, you may be asking? Well, there was a memo that came out on June 4th that confirmed that the course would not become an official class for the 2024-25 year. So basically, they were piloting this course. Can we offer AP African American Studies? What's the student interest level? What's the feedback on it? Et cetera, et cetera. So despite getting good feedback from students, teachers, and, the people who are actually involved in this, they still decided to say, no, we're not going to offer this as an official class. Now, that memo came after the Post and Courier reported that the department had emailed school districts across the state saying the course code for the 2-year pilot class would no longer be valid for academic credit. So they were kind of trying to do this without making a big announcement. But once the local media started sniffing around, they had to release something. Now, I mentioned students, stakeholders, et cetera, had good things to say about the course. Yeah, students specifically mentioned to the Post and Courier, or at least at this rally, they described the course as rigorous and refreshing. So why did they axe it? I mean, we know why, but is there a good explanation? Well, the department's memo cited, quote, significant controversy surrounding the course concerning issues directly addressed by the South Carolina's General Assembly in a budget proviso, as well as in pending permanent legislation, end quote. Those were the reasons for bringing the course to a halt. The department reviewed the course's framework, and they found that the required concepts included things like, quote, interlocking systems of oppression, end quote, intersectionality, which is related to social categories like sex, gender, and race. That violates South Carolina's state budget proviso, which remains in place for the 2024-25 budget. So what is a proviso? It's part of the budget, basically like something that's added to the budget. When you think budget, you're thinking money allocated here, there, or whatever. This was a note basically saying no funds may be used to provide instruction using any kind of curricula that includes concepts related to individuals by virtue of their race or sex as being inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously, which is ridiculous. That is not what the course is about. It's not placing blame on anyone who is living today. It is not saying if you are white, black, or whatever, you are X, Y, and Z because of that, or that anything, you're inherently racist because you were born as whatever. That's why that little caveat that they added, consciously or unconsciously. So if some student just misconstrues the lesson as, oh, they're trying to make me feel bad because I'm white, and they're trying to say because I'm white, I'm inherently racist. That makes me feel bad. Therefore, this is against the state law, essentially, which is crazy. Could you imagine that concept being applied to anything else? If you're not consciously saying these things, if you're not outright saying these things or even alluding to it, and a student just misunderstands, we wouldn't have any classes like, oh, this feels like this math problem, it feels like you're attacking me because of my race, or it's making me feel like I'm inherently bad at math, or whatever. We all know why this was applied specifically to African American studies and nothing else, and that is not to say that teaching, if a teacher were to be like, hey, if you're white or if you're black, you're inherently X, Y, or Z, that's obviously wrong. And no one should be doing that. But that's not what this course was doing. But they're just, whether they want to get rid of this course because of their own beliefs, or they just don't want the headache that's going to come along with it when they get pushback from people claiming this is, critical race theory or whatever else. So very disappointing to say the least, but doesn't appear to be changing, at least anytime soon. Very disappointing to see that AP African American Studies will no longer be offered. And again, it was a pilot. This isn't a long-term thing, but it was specifically an AP course, so not even a requirement for anyone to take. It wasn't like this was a general course that every student takes. It's specifically an AP level course, and because they're afraid, or perhaps because they believe what some of the far right believes when it comes to this. If you mention race basically in any way, shape, or form, it's bad. It's just disappointing that for whatever reason, this is the decision they came to. That'll do it for this edition of Holy City Center Radio. I hope you have an amazing weekend. If you need plans, go to holycitycenter.com/calendar. Have fun out there. I'll talk to you again on Monday. Thank you again to Lindsay Marie Collins with LMC Soundsystem for producing this and every episode, and also Tyler Boone, whose music you hear in each and every show. Talk to you after the weekend, but as always, good night and good luck.